Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancements Phase 2 Working Group Series. To kick things off for this first session, we're going to be having our panelists speak on the Enhancing BA Level NPM, exploring the grouping approach. The next slide will just kind of cover the call reminders, as this call is being recorded for informational and communicative purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. During this meeting, it is structured as a working group. We also will have examples, and also please be mindful of our presenters pausing moments to ask questions. We will have opportunities to ask questions through chat and verbal, so be watching out for raised hands during the call. And also, we will be expecting informal written feedback within the sessions, and there will be an opportunity for formal written feedback and in different sessions depending on which ones we will be targeting. But at this time, all feedback is recommended, and we will be announcing that. For this meeting, we just have the raise hand icon located on the lower toolbar that you can be added to the raise hand queue. As well, if you are just dialed in through the phone line on your mobile device, make sure you just press *3, and we'll be adding you to that raise hand queue to ask a question. And as a reminder, make sure you say your full name and affiliation before speaking. The next slide, we just want to do a quick overview of our standard CAISO policy initiative stakeholder process. This is a typical process. At this time, the price formation enhancement is working on the working group phase, as well as phase 2 of the price formation enhancements. So at this time, we do have tentative dates that are scheduled on our working group series, and those also are listed on a link at the very last page that hyperlinks it to that page where we provided 2 weeks ago on all the meetings coming up for NPM, faster pricing, scarcity pricing, and so forth. There's more information on that document PDF, so feel free to see it, and we'll submit it in the chat for those who were able to see it a few weeks ago when we posted it. At this time, this agenda will have a recap of the BA level NPM fundamental rationale for a grouping approach with James. And then the last hour grouping approach will be an initial proposal, illustrative examples, and walkthroughs with George and Jelitas. And that last, we will do an open discussion Q&A. We will be posting these slides during this call. We just were able to wrap them up, so we'll have those we'll have those posted for everyone to follow. So we appreciate everyone's patience with us at this time for this call. And at this time, we'll go ahead and invite James. I do see you on audio. Just do a quick audio check before we get started.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. And good morning, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about BA level market power mitigation, in particular, talking more about the idea of a grouping methodology for assessing market power within in the BA market power test. This slide walks through what we hope to accomplish from today's working group session. There are 4 main objectives. First, we'll focus on understanding why we should consider a grouping approach for BA level market power mitigation. Second, we'll identify both the key challenges and potential benefits of implementing a grouping methodology, and we'll talk about some of the stakeholder feedback, stakeholder concerns and questions, and we've made sure to integrate the answers to, or our responses to those questions within the presentation itself. Third, we'll engage in detailed discussions about 2 critical aspects of the grouping approach, which is first how to define the BA groups, and then how to sequence the NPM assessments. So we'll appreciate your input during those discussions to make sure that we shape a workable methodology. Finally, we will walk through some illustrative examples and some specific scenarios to see how the grouping approach might work in practice. And this will allow us to get hands-on and give everyone an opportunity to provide some feedback on sort of how the practical implementation of the approach might work. Let's go to the next slide. So this walks through a planned schedule of discussions for BA level market power mitigation within the context of the overall price formation enhancements phase 2 effort. So as of right now, we're planning on at least 4 specific BA level MPM discussions, with which today makes up one of the 4. And we wanted to put the slide together to make it clear what we're focusing on today and what we're not focusing on today, and to give you a picture about when we might come back to discuss other components of the market power mitigation discussion. So today is specifically to talk about the grouping approach and to walk through the examples of the grouping approach. We're planning a session on November 20th to talk about some other modifications to the BA level process that have come up in the phase 1 working groups, including but not limited to the opportunity potentially only to mitigate pivotal suppliers rather than all suppliers in the BA level test, and also the consideration of an impact test to mitigate offers with LMP impacts above a defined threshold in the BA level test. So I just want to be clear that there are modifications that will be discussed within this working group track that are not going to be the focus of today's discussion. So we'll try to keep questions about that till November 20th. Then we want to share that in March, we plan to have 2 working group sessions dedicated to analysis related to BA level market power. The first session will talk about the structural competitive analysis of the CAISO BA specifically. And then that will lead into discussion about whether the CAISO BA should be included in the BA level market power test and treated like any other BA in the test. So the presentation today will also consider how the grouping approach might differ depending on whether the CAISO BA is assumed to be competitive at all times or not. And so we can talk about that a little bit, but we figured the analysis would be helpful in sort of justifying our future direction on whether to include CAISO in the test. Finally, on March 19th, we're planning on having an analysis relating directly to the grouping approach, and whatever we decide moving forward in this working group phase about what the a BA level MPM approach might look like, we'll have analysis to see what is the impact on the frequency of mitigation compared to the status quo. So if we're seeing, hopefully that we're seeing more accurate and we think with the BA grouping approach, lower frequency of mitigation relative to the status quo, and we'll come back in March to make sure that, given the analysis, that seems to be true. And then finally, we're planning on publishing a straw proposal for a combined straw proposal for BA level market power and scarcity pricing in mid-May. And I'll also add that there are, I believe, 4 possible sessions that don't have defined topics yet that we posted in our schedule a few weeks ago. And that will allow us to have some overflow time just in case there are topics that the 3-hour sessions are not sufficient to fully discuss. And also if there are other things that get brought up during the working group discussions that were not anticipated in phase 1 or at this time, then we'll have some extra sessions potentially to, some extra time to just have those discussions. And so those may be market power mitigation related if there are additional things that we need to talk about that can fill up those 4 additional sessions before May. Next slide, please. Okay, so this turning away from the overall schedule now into the actual market power mitigation fundamentals. Let's go to the next slide. So there are 3 main policy objectives of BA level market power mitigation, and the history of these objectives have been covered in length in both the discussion paper and in the phase 1 working groups. The most important policy objective of BA level market power mitigation is to ensure competitive pricing across the market footprint. When BAs become price separated or import constrained from other areas, there's a potential, those BAs are not able to receive competitive supply from external BAAs. And so it's appropriate at that time to evaluate whether or not generation within the BA can meet the demand competitively to ensure that prices that result from the market are those that would occur given sufficient competitive pressure. Second, the second policy objective of BA level market power is to address structural market power concerns that arose during the formation of the WEIM, because the WEIM has many entities that are vertically integrated and own or control most of the generation within their balancing area. There was many discussions within the formation of the WEIM that extra protections were needed for market power mitigation purposes to make sure that third-party generation or third-party load and independent renewable and other generators are able to access the competitive market through the Western EIM. And now with 22 participating entities in the Western EIM, one of the things that we're considering is that given the expansion of the market footprint, the old way of doing BA level market power may be out of date. Finally, the BA level market power mitigation process supports market-based rate authority for Western EIM participants and provides a foundation to FERC to grant market-based rate authority to Western EIM participants. I'll pause for a question.
Let's go ahead and take Alva from PG&E.
Hi, James. Thank you for this. This is a foundational question. Just when EDAM is implemented, assuming this initiative is not simultaneously implemented, there will be local market power mitigation throughout the EDAM footprint, I believe, right?
So there will be local market power mitigation in the EDAM. There will also be BAA level market power mitigation in the EDAM. However, the BA level market power mitigation method in the EDAM is the status quo for the Western EIM. So it would not include a grouping approach that we're discussing today.
Right.
And if the grouping approach, if the grouping approach that we're discussing today were to go forward, it would, at this time, it's not planned for that to be implemented on EDAM day one. And so, it would be maybe a year one or year two feature of the EDAM.
Right. So this is addressing the potential of essentially the potential of over mitigation in the EDAM is essentially what is being discussed here. Is there also a system level market power mitigation that's performed in the day ahead? I thought there was there's at least something around commitment costs, but I was trying to remember where that fit into this structure. Is there no other form of market power mitigation other than the local market power mitigation day ahead in real time? And then you're saying there's a BAA level market power mitigation in the EIM?
Yeah, so there's no other dynamic MPM process that I'm aware of other than the local market power mitigation and the BA level process. And again, both of those two processes will apply in the EIM and in the EDAM together. And so, if this sort of concept goes forward, that would alter the BA level approach both for the EDAM and the Western EIM going forward.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is a flow chart to illustrate how the dynamic competitive path assessment works and how it evaluates competitive conditions. And we're aware that there are some concerns that the name dynamic competitive path assessment is an awkward name for the BA level test because it's not actually a physical path that's being evaluated. And we'll kind of see that through this example. And we had a similar flow chart in the discussion paper presentation, but it was expanded a little bit with help from some colleagues. So I think it will make it a little more clear. we first start on the very left, where first a BA in the Western EIM or the EDAM becomes price separated, either on its own or with other BAs from the general market. And right now, the decision point to decide whether or not to test a BAA that's price separated for market power mitigation at the BA level is if their marginal energy cost is greater than the CAISO's. So again, we talked at length in the working group phase 1 that the CAISO BA today in the EIM and in the EDAM of tomorrow will set the competitive reference for testing BA level market power. And that assumption is something that we're going to be discussing during this phase 2 process. So if you're price separated and your marginal energy cost is greater than the CAISO's, the DCPA will assess whether your internal generation is competitive using a 3 pivotal supplier test. And we'll talk more about what the 3 pivotal supplier test looks like. We'll have detailed examples of how that works in the future slides. If the BA's marginal is price separated and its marginal energy cost is less than the CAISO's, then no mitigation is applied. Because again, the CAISO in today's test is seen as the competitive reference. And so there's no reason to test a BAA in today's construct that has a lower marginal energy cost than the CAISO's. So if the DCPA identifies if the DCPA runs the 3 pivotal supplier tests and does not identify uncompetitive conditions, meaning there's sufficient fringe competitive supply to meet the overall demand in the balancing area, then no mitigation is applied. However, if the DCPA fails and does identify uncompetitive conditions, which means that there is not sufficient competitive supply to meet the demand without the 3 biggest suppliers, then the BAs are subject to mitigation. And what subject to mitigation means is that the bids of the supply offers in that balancing area are evaluated to see 2 things. One, does it exceed the individual resources default energy bid? And that is on a resource by resource basis. Second, does it exceed a competitive LMP, which is a single price for the entire balancing area, which in today's market, in the status quo for BA level MPM would be the CAISO's marginal energy cost. So a bid must exceed, if a bid exceeds, or if the bid exceeds both of these values, then the bid is mitigated to the higher of these values to constitute a competitive level. And if the bid is not higher than both of these values, then no mitigation is applied. So a couple of important points here is to say first that when the DCPA identifies uncompetitive conditions, it means that a balancing area is subject to mitigation, but does not automatically apply mitigation unless the bids are greater than the resource's individual default energy bid and the area's overall competitive LMP. And we'll talk at length about in the future slides about what the competitive LMP is and how it's calculated. So that'll be an interesting example. I'll pause for questions.
Yes, James, just on the mitigation, is the mitigation of the entire bid or is it mitigation from a solution point?
So you're asking if in the bid curve, in the MPM process, does the MPM or does the bid change the entire bid above the DEB and competitive LMP change down to the lower level, or only the segments that are sort of within the dispatch target? Is that this overall question?
General, that's kind of what I'm asking. Yeah.
I believe it's each segment is compared to the DEB and the competitive LMP. George, can you confirm that's true?
Hello. Hi, James. Can you repeat the question, please?
So Alba, do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm just sort of trying to compare it to LMPM where the mitigation is from a point in the MPM solution up and up.
Yes.
Just looking at the flow chart, it seems to indicate that the entire bid is mitigated, and I just wanted to check if from where is mitigation?
Yeah, it's similar to the LMPM concept and similar to how this is done today in EIM. You have a competitive LMP, so the energy bid that is subject to mitigation is mitigated for the portion of the energy bid that has a price above that competitive LMP, and then you select the lower of the price submitted with the bid or the DEB, the default energy bid for the specific resource on a segment by segment basis for that portion of the energy bid that has a price above the competitive LMP.
Okay, thank you.
Go to the next question.
Yeah, hi, James. Josh Arnold, GDS Associates. Clarification on that last item. Let's say we have 3 bid segments, all above the triggers. So 3 bid segments that need to be mitigated. Does the mitigation process collapse those 3 bid segments into one at the higher of the DEB or the competitive LMP, or does it retain the quantities of those 3 bid segments and then stagger the bids by a certain amount? Does that make sense?
Yeah, James, maybe I can answer this one. So, hi, Josh. Essentially, the bid segments are not collapsed. So each bid segment is maintained and the mitigation is performed on a segment by segment basis. So each segment is mitigated to the lower of the bid segment that was submitted or the DEB segment for that resource. And because this mitigation is on a segment by segment basis, you may end up having more segments than the number of segments that you submitted, particularly when your bid doesn't stack evenly on a segment by segment basis with your DEB segments. So you may end up having more segments. It's something that you can see today in the existing mitigation process. We're not changing this aspect.
Okay, I guess my question then, George, is let's say you have only one DEB for the 3 bid segments.
You mean a single price DEB?
A single price
One
DEB.
segment?
One segment. So in that case, you have 3 bid segments all sharing the same DEB price segment. Would that be then, say it's 10 megawatts at N, 10 megawatts at N2, 10 megawatts at N3? Would the resulting mitigated bid then be 30 megawatts at, call it DEB segment? Or would it be 10 megawatts at DEB segment, 10 megawatts at DEB segment, and 10 megawatts at DEB segment? In which case it wouldn't be monotonically increasing.
Yeah, so you're describing a case where the DEB is a single price DEB, is a single segment, and that happens to be the lower of all the submitted bid segments. So when you mitigate each segment, they all come down to the same DEB price. So the system that we have, in this case, joins all the segments, and the resulting mitigated bid is also going to be a single segment. So yes, exactly. You pointed out the fact that we want to have monotonically increasing bids, so you don't want to have segments that they all have the same price. We join those segments. The system will do that.
Great. Thanks for the clarification, George.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for jumping in. I just want to acknowledge a question in the chat to confirm. I think it was answered, but just to confirm that DEBs are resource specific, where competitive LMPs, there is a single competitive LMP across the entire balancing area. So when you're looking at comparing the resources bid to its DEB, that is a resource specific thing, but then there's this overall competitive LMP that they're also evaluated against. Other questions?
Mark Smith, can you go ahead and introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hey, James, it's Mark Smith with Calpine. Maybe you're going to talk about this later, but can you address any interaction between this DCPA and the local market power mitigation that's been proposed as well?
So I guess the question might be, if you have, let's say you have a BAA that's mitigated in the BA level process, but then there are also uncompetitive local constraints in the BA as well, how they might overlap?
Yes.
That's a good question. So I think in that case, because you're comparing in the local market power process and in the BA level NPM process, you're comparing the bids to the same reference prices, that I don't think even if you were to have the same resource that's being mitigated under two different processes, it would probably result in the same outcome. George, do you see any nuances there?
Just the process of how this is performed. It's true that you may have multiple uncompetitive constraints contributing to the marginal congestion component of the LMP for a specific resource. And the way we handle it today, we don't plan to change that. Essentially, you divide the LMP at a resource location to what we call a competitive portion and an uncompetitive portion. The uncompetitive portion is having contributions from uncompetitive constraints, which is the result of the DCPA assessment for each constraint. And the BAA level mitigation is very similar in the sense that the constraint that you're testing for competitiveness is the power balance constraint for that BAA. That's what you're testing for. So you can see that all of it comes together, and you essentially have any constraint that is binding, be it a transmission constraint or the power balance constraint, which is always binding for a BAA. If it's assessed to be non-competitive, and then it has a non-competitive contribution to the marginal congestion component, or to the power balance constraint contributes to the marginal energy cost portion of the LMP, but it doesn't matter. You split this also in a competitive portion, which is your competitive LMP, and anything additional is your uncompetitive contribution. And then you sum up all these uncompetitive contributions to the LMP, and if it's positive, the outcome, then the assessment tells you that this resource has the potential to exercise market power to increase the LMP because it has a positive total contribution from uncompetitive constraints. And then you go ahead and you mitigate that resource. So that's not different than what we do today with LMPM, where you can have multiple contributions, and in EIM, when you have also some of this one additional contribution coming from the BAA level mitigation, or basically it's the contribution of an uncompetitive power balance constraint for the BAA. So similar to that effect here, this approach does not change this mechanism. If a BAA or a group of BAAs, later on that we'll talk about that, is not competitive, then the LMP at all resources, and this on a resource by resource basis, if you have also LMPM factored in, is having contributions that are from competitive constraints and uncompetitive constraints. So you separate those, and then you look at the sum of all the uncompetitive contributions. If it's positive, then you go ahead and you mitigate the resource. So basically the mitigation is done once. It's not for every uncompetitive constraint that you find that the resource has an impact. So you consider all the impact, and then at the end, you make a determination whether the resource bid has to be mitigated based on the net effect of all the contributions to uncompetitive constraints.
Wow, that was a long answer. Thanks, George. Let me ask a simpler question. Is it correct that a local resource would be mitigated to the lower of the the LMPM mitigated bid or the BAA system-wide mitigated bid?
So there is one competitive LMP that will apply to all resources in a specific BAA. And if you find that this, let's say the energy bid for that resource needs to be mitigated because of all what I said earlier, this assessment, then you going to mitigate the energy bid that is only for the portion that is above that competitive LMP. So your competitive LMP is like an anchor of what is your competitive portion of the LMP. And then if the rest of the LMP, which is uncompetitive, is a positive quantity when you add up all the components, then you mitigate the portion of the energy bid above that competitive LMP to the lower of the resource DEB or the bid that was submitted.
All right. Thanks, George. Sorry for that tangent, James, but I apprate the conversation.
No, not at all. Actually, I want to kind of expand on your question because I heard your question a little differently. So first, let me retract my original statement that there is a single competitive LMP for the BA level process, but George, there would be locational specific competitive LMPs in the LMPM process, right? And if it were the case where a resource, you're mitigating on the BA level process and the local market power process, I heard Mark's question as, well, now you've got this competitive LMP through the BA level process, but then also my location specific competitive LMP that takes out all the non-competitive congestion components at my location. And how does the system evaluate compared to those different competitive LMPs? Do I have that question right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so you have components on the LMP, right? So you take the marginal energy cost component, okay? And then you have a competitive LMP for that. We'll see how this comes out, right? In this case today, it's the marginal energy cost for the ISO BAA. So if you're in a BAA that has a higher marginal energy cost, the difference is uncompetitive. And then you look into the marginal component, marginal congestion component, and that has contributions from various binding constraints. And you separate the contributions from competitive and uncompetitive constraints. So now you have competitive and uncompetitive components in the LMP. You sum up all the uncompetitive components, and if the net is positive, then you proceed to mitigate the energy bid for the resource. So that's how LMPM and the BAA level mitigation come together. It's a single approach where essentially the power balance constraint is considered just as another constraint that is binding, which you assess whether it's competitive or non-competitive, and then it falls into the same process for assessing mitigation for the resource.
And then ultimately the price that gets applied to the mitigation process is the highest of those various uncompetitive or those various procedures to establish competitive LMP?
The competitive LMP is like in this process here is the marginal energy cost of the ISO. In the grouping approach, we'll discuss how it's been determined. Once you have the competitive LMP and you have the assessment that the energy bid of a resource needs to be mitigated, then you only mitigate the energy bid portion that is priced higher than the competitive LMP. And in this process, you go on a segment by segment basis and you select the lower of the bid that was submitted or the default energy bid for the resource. Unlike today, there's no difference.
Okay, let's move into Mark. Do you have an extension to your question?
I don't. Thanks, James.
You got it. Let's go to the next question.
Callie Wells,
Hi.
go ahead.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells, WPTF. I have an extension to that question. Okay, so I thought I understood it, and then I probably confused myself with all of those responses. So I apologize if this is a very simple question, and hopefully it's a very simple answer. So for a single resource that is in the BAA, is there one competitive LMP, and it's the same value used for both the BAA level mitigation and the local market power mitigation? Or for that single resource, could you have one competitive LMP that is going to be used for the local market power mitigation and potentially another one that's used for the BAA level market power mitigation? Or will they always be the same number?
Hi, Callie. This is George.
Hey, George.
So there's a, yeah, so it's a very good question because there's a difference between what we do today and what we're proposing to do here with the grouping approach. So today, LMPM has its own anchor for what is a competitive LMP, which is actually looking at two buses in the core of the ISO high voltage transmission, either Midway or Vincent, depending on how the direction of flow is, if it's northbound or southbound, right? So this is traditionally the competitive LMP that is used for LMPM. And then the BAA level mitigation that is today used in EIM is using the marginal energy cost for the ISO balancing authority area as the competitive LMP to make the mitigation for all resources in the BAA that are found to being non-competitive for meeting the demand in that BAA. So today you have essentially two different anchors. One is for the marginal energy component of the LMP, which is the competitive LMP for that is the ISO, balancing authority area marginal energy cost, or the SMEC today because we haven't made the transition yet. And for the LMPM, you're looking at the congestion component of your anchor bus, whether Vincent or Midway. And you use this to separate the LMP to competitive and uncompetitive portions. With this proposal here, we consolidate all of this because once you have a competitive LMP, that we will show how you calculate it based on the assessment that is going to work with grouping of various balancing authority areas. When you're going to mitigate now resources in a BAA, you have a competitive LMP already. So there's no real reason, we believe, to look for an anchor at the ISO system because we're trying to have a process that works in a way that it's not ISO-centric. You're making an evaluation based on the solution from the market power mitigation pass. So what we're proposing here, we'll have a single competitive LMP that will be used for the mitigation of all resources in a specific BAA. So it brings the two together. So that's why it's a good question and one that we're hoping to address a little bit later. But since you brought it up, this is the answer that I can give you right now.
Okay, I appreciate that. Sorry, yeah, I think it was kind of going back to Mark's original question. So today there's two, tomorrow there's one. And I will wait for the more in-depth conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, and it's good to separate the pieces, right? The two that are today that apply to different portions of the LMP, right? So the SMEC today applies to the marginal energy cost component of the LMP. The difference with the SMEC is considered congestion today, and if it's uncompetitive, positive in that sense, then it goes into the uncompetitive portion of the LMP for the assessment of mitigation. And then you have your regular contributions from LMPM, which also have their own competitive LMP based on the Midway or Vincent marginal congestion cost. But yeah, it's complicated today because it has those two different anchors for two different components of the LMP. And this approach that we are going to discuss today is bringing everything together. So you'll have one anchor for the mitigation.
Thanks everyone for your questions, and thanks George for chipping in there. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this set of slides will talk about a rationale for the grouping approach. Let's go to the next slide. So as we discussed at length in the phase 1 process of the working groups, the working group, I think, agrees that there are limitations of the current BA level methodology with which, exploring a potential grouping approach makes sense. Today's BA level mitigation process tests BAs by themselves. And I'm going to rephrase this a little bit because it ignores supply contributions from resources in other BAs, but it does account for transfers, as we will see in the examples coming up. So the supply contribution from other balancing areas is included within the RSI, but what it doesn't include are the competitive suppliers that on the other side of the transfer. And that'll make more sense once we go through the examples. The current methodology may overestimate structural market power and lead to excessive mitigation because you're not considering the competitive suppliers on the other side of a unbinding transfer. And then finally, we've talked that the methodology that we have today for BA level market power was devised when the Western EIM only constituted a handful of entities. And now with 22 entities in the Western EIM and a growing EDAM footprint, it makes sense to think that we need to update the methodology to something that captures better the complex dynamics of the competitive landscape of the market today. So a couple extra notes, just building off the conversation from the schedule. There are going to be extensions of these limitations that will be discussed on the 20th. Today's discussion is limited to the grouping approach, but we will be having these other types of discussions in future working group sessions. Next slide, please. So we think there are at least 3 potential advantages of a grouping approach. First, the grouping approach we think will provide a more accurate assessment of structural competitiveness because you're able to account for the competitive suppliers across transfer location that's unbinding. Second, it should reduce unnecessary mitigation by considering that broader available supply. And third, that it better reflects the actual market conditions of the Western EIM and future EDAM and the competitive dynamics therein. Next slide, please. So here's the next 2 slides will talk about some stakeholder feedback that we received in the phase 1 working group process on the grouping approach. And we'll try to respond to all of these on the next 2 slides sometime in this presentation. The overall sentiment coming out of the phase 1 was that there was general support for continued exploration of a grouping approach with some caveats, of course, that we'll talk about. And most stakeholders seemed at least cautiously supportive of the grouping concept in principle and see it as potentially improving the market power mitigation accuracy. There are a couple of key concerns that were raised. These were 4 notable ones. One concern that was raised was whether the DCPA trigger is appropriate for assessing BA level market power, the DCPA trigger being the condition that evaluates whether BAs are price separated above the CAISO. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Second, there were concerns about the increased complexity of a grouping approach and that it may make after the fact review more difficult. Third is the potential impact on market clearing time for the Western EIM and the EDAM. And fourth, there were concerns about, does the grouping approach ensure that the frequency of mitigation reduces? Also, could a BA pass individually but fail as a group? So we'll talk about all of those things in the coming slides. Next slide, please. Here are some key methodology questions that came out of the phase 1 working group process. In last November's discussion, DMM had raised some technical questions about how the demand for counterflow is calculated and the implications that has on whether transfers are deemed competitive or not in the current process. And that's something that George will address in the examples that are coming up. We'll talk about how both supply and demand for counterflow is calculated with an example coming up. There were questions about what does it mean to have a direct transfer connection? The methodology groups BAs together that have that are price separated together, and part of the logic of the assessment requires knowledge of which BAs have a direct transfer connection, because that's the way to establish whether or not a competitive supplier in one area can provide competition in another. And so we'll talk about that. Third, what is the logic that defines how the competitive LMP is set? There's a lot of discussion about that already, but we'll go into more detail on that. Fourth, when does the NPM assessment stop? So in the status quo, the assessment stops and does not test BAs that have a lower MEC than the CAISO. And so when is the appropriate place for the NPM assessment to stop under the grouping approach? Finally, how does the methodology change whether or not the test includes the CAISO BAA? And by includes the CAISO BAA, we mean that the CAISO BAA is evaluated for competitiveness or not. Remembering that under the status quo, the CAISO BAA is not evaluated. So we'll talk a little bit more about how the methodology might look differently depending on if the CAISO is included. Next slide, please. So we have some feedback on some of the key concerns that we can discuss. The key concerns being those that were listed in the yellow box on slide 14. Generally speaking, the concerns, we continue to think that the current trigger for the BA level NPM test being the price separation between balancing areas is an appropriate trigger. Because whenever a BA is isolated from external supply and fails the three pivotal supplier test, that creates structural conditions within that BA with which internal pivotal suppliers may have the impact to affect the market price. And we need to be ensuring that competitive market outcomes are accomplished regardless of the prevailing price level. So the mitigation, I guess, in a nutshell, is not necessarily about the prevailing prices, high or low. It's about ensuring that the prices are, converge to what you would expect under sufficient competition. And so the decision about when to test either local or NBA level process is about the structural conditions and making sure that the structural conditions within that constrained area are sufficiently competitive. That being said, we recognize the concern that, the previous DMM data showed that much of the BA level mitigation was occurring during the high renewable, low price periods in the middle of the day. And so we will be talking about on the 20th whether it makes sense to consider an impact test to see whether or not there should be a LMP change threshold that must apply before applying mitigation. And so, to summarize, we think that the trigger remains appropriate, but if stakeholders think that it's a good idea to consider an impact test because of the way that BA level mitigation has been applied in the past, then we'll talk about that on the 20th. To support the comment about the grouping approach may make it more difficult to review after the fact why a BAA was mitigated, the CAISO will, of course, publish the relevant data that is needed to support that after the fact review. Our feeling as of now is that the grouping approach should minimally impact the EDAM and Western EAM solve times because the grouping approach is not an optimization. The algorithm is complicated on paper, but computationally, we don't see much of an impact on solve time. And we can't rule out the possibility that a BA could pass individually but fail as a group. That is possible. And the idea would be that the grouping approach, hopefully on net, would provide a more accurate NPM assessment and overall reduce the amount of mitigation in the Western Dam and the EDAM. But it would not be a guarantee that that would happen at all times. And so one of the things that we plan to do in the March analysis discussions is to see, maybe investigate some case studies to see if this is happening and how often. And so that should shed some light to see, what the expected reduction in mitigation overall might be, understanding that at times, the status quo may not have mitigated you where the grouping approach would, and that might happen from time to time. Pause for questions.
We have Mike first. Let's go ahead. Mike, you're unmuted.
Thanks. Hey, James, this is Mike Castellano from GDS Associates. I have a couple comments here. One, when you say the NPM process should apply whenever a BA is price separated, when we get around to implementation, we got to be careful that you're looking at price separated in the positive direction and cut off from supply in the sense that it is importing the max or importing the max along at least one, connection path there. Because, they could be cut off from external supply by exporting the max to everybody around them, and would not be necessarily appropriate for mitigation at that point, I think. Okay.
That's a good clarification. Yeah.
And then, so this is kind of funny. So when I was at CAISO, I think it was 9 years ago, because it was shortly after my daughter was born, so I remember when it was. We talked about this general idea in some of the EIM NPM changes. And one thing that I recall that I think answers this last bullet point, right now we test the NPM basically tests like resources individually, right? You're looking at what the pricing situation is at an individual resource. So when you get into testing these BAA groups, what you're really doing is testing each BAA. And so if you do it in a way that, you test the BAA, does it pass by itself? Yes. Then you don't test that BAA grouped with anybody else. You can move to the next BAA that could be next door, and you're testing that BAA, including potential supply from the BA you just tested, but you're not necessarily applying any further examination to the BA that passed on its own. And I think there's a way to do that iterative approach where, it's sort of like once you get that check mark that, you pass with the competitive supply, further tests don't impact whether or not you pass. Or further tests don't impact the status of mitigation within that BA. So I think it is, depending on how you design it, it's possible to ensure that, if the BAA passes individually, it will not fail as a group.
Yeah, those are interesting comments, and I think mostly align with what you'll see in the upcoming slides when we get into the nitty-gritty of the algorithm. But I'd encourage you to keep those thoughts in mind when you're reviewing the algorithm, because one thing that kind of popped out at me that, not to give George a heart attack or anything, but if you really wanted to protect against number 4, you could add into the algorithm to only test as a group if the BA fails as an individual BA. Therefore, if it passes on its own, it will automatically pass. It cannot fail as a group. So that could be a possible step that we could put. But I'll defer a little bit of that into the algorithm is pretty well defined. So keep that in mind as we review it.
Okay, so you're saying that the algorithm is already determined?
Well, we have an initial concept that we'll iterate on. But how to put something out there to give people something to chew on.
Okay, thanks, James.
Thank you.
Next, we have Callie Wells. James, let's make sure.
Hi. Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF again. I just want to make sure I understood something that you said earlier. So am I understanding correct that you said the CAISO's current position is the trigger used today is appropriate, even though DMM's analysis during the working group process showed it's triggered during the shoulder months and off-peak hours most frequently, which is when you're having high renewables trying to get out of California and go to the other DAAs?
Yes, we're saying that.
Is that the CAISO's position at this point? Because that seems somewhat counterintuitive, especially if we haven't had a chance to really continue that conversation.
Yeah, so it does create conditions where there are certain areas within the Western AM that become import constrained, and therefore, they're not able to receive additional competitive supply from outside of the market, and there'd be a potential for internal suppliers to potentially exercise market power over the prevailing price in that BA if they're import constrained. And it does, and that fundamental does not depend on the prevailing price level. And so that could happen at really low price times of the day, high price times of the day. We do agree that generally market power concerns are most astute during high price times of the day, but it doesn't guarantee that the only times with which uncompetitive conditions can exist are during the peak periods and the highest price times of the day.
Okay, so that is the CAISO's current position, and I guess maybe I'm a little, I was hoping that maybe we would be able to have kind of a more holistic conversation about this before CAISO's positions were put out there, because, as you noted, the next meeting, I think we're possibly talking about a conduct and impact test, which is, a different paradigm for evaluating market power mitigation. So I guess maybe my ask is just if we can allow those conversations to happen and all come together at the end of the day, what is the best approach, I guess would be my ask. But I appreciate you clarifying that is the CAISO's current position, but hopefully we can continue having conversations about that.
Okay, yeah, and we acknowledge that an impact test may be an appropriate additional step to the current process, given the, history of when this type of mitigation seems to apply, that we think it's reasonable that an impact test might, reduce, it might be appropriate given that history. And so, yeah, we had planned to talk more about that on the 20th, but thanks for bringing it up.
Okay. No, that's great. And then will you guys possibly have, because I know you just mentioned that you kind of have a algorithm in concept right now for this approach, will you have something similar that we can chew on during the 20th? Or I guess if you don't, my ask would be that you do, so that we kind of can start comparing the different approaches.
I'm sorry, was that information about material on the 20th? Can you repeat it? Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, it's okay. Just that, because it sounds like you guys have a concept in mind that we'll talk about here shortly on this, the grouping approach. And so hopefully when we talk about the conduct and impact test on the 20th, I guess my question is, do you guys plan on having also a concept at that point developed enough that we can also kind of chew on it as well?
Yeah, and so, just to clarify, these are, we're putting out some initial ideas to get this, this is an open discussion and we're open to feedback, and we're trying to move the ball forward and put some ideas out there to have people deliberate on. And so, when we talk about the grouping approach today, this is just an initial concept for us all to start somewhere and work on. And we hope that through collaboration, we get to a point where we're all, comfortable with the direction moving forward. And the same would apply to the impact test. So we would put you know, what you might expect is that the KISA, similar to the material you'll see in the upcoming slides, would put together some ideas of what it could look like, you know, different types of thresholds, price thresholds and stuff, and that all of that will be subject to discussion. So I hope that's what you're hoping for.
Oh yeah, nope, it is. Just wanted to confirm. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, let's move to the next slide. I think this is the last slide in my presentation, which is just to, if you would like to review some of the material from previous PFE working group sessions on market power mitigation. We talked about NPM at working group session 4 and 7 in detail. So those links are there, and you can also view those links on our website. Also, the discussion paper and stakeholder recommendations and its presentation had similar discussions on BA level market power. If you are going through this presentation and you're totally lost, then this would be a good place to review. So hopefully find that helpful. Okay, so I'm gonna pause here for last questions on the material that I presented before I turn the presentation over to George to walk through more detail of the grouping concept. We'll pause for a question.
Yeah, James, this is Alpha again. Just a question of curiosity. Is it possible that a participant external to a BAA could be mitigated as being one of the pivotal suppliers to a given BAA?
That's a great question. So that I'm going to defer that to the list of things in the modifications bucket that we'll talk about on the 20th, and that actually we haven't talked about. It's a good question that we didn't talk about enough in the phase 1 process that I think we should give some airtime. And I think what you're, let me make sure I understand the question correctly, which is that I think what you're saying would only apply in the local market power scheme where a uncompetitive constraint in one BAA could have shift factor contributions from a resource located outside of the balancing area itself, in which case you may want to evaluate the, all suppliers affected to that constraint regardless of the BA boundary. Does that sound like what you're asking?
That was part of it, and the other was just like, is it possible because of grouping that you would then essentially start including participants from other BAAs in the test of market power, and that essentially some participant becomes mitigatable because of the grouping, which would not have been the case otherwise. That was just wondering about, and this is all just curiosity, really. So.
Okay, so good to know on the LMPM. On the second part of the question, I'll defer you to the examples because it will become much more clear once we go through the examples how that will work.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Any last questions before we move on? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, at this time, I'll turn the presentation over to George.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you, George, and see you.
Thank you, Brenda. Okay, so this is an initial draft of the grouping algorithm. We wanted to present you something so that you can, relate with how this proposed methodology is going to work. And my apologies, it's more complicated than what we wanted to present. And it's complicated because it has some topological elements that initially were hoping to leave out, but unfortunately we have to consider them. And topology is always making algorithms more complicated. And this is something that we still need to work on, test it, make sure it's robust and efficient. But this is a first look on how this method will work. It will answer some of the questions that we had received so far, but it may raise some more questions. So of course we'll be here to answer them, or later on if you submit them to us. And no, it's not set in stone. It's just an initial draft of how this methodology is going to work. It has several steps. The first few steps are very straightforward. Essentially, we group balancing authority areas from the get-go if they have the same marginal energy cost. This is because that means that any transfers between those balancing authority areas, they are not at their scheduling limit in the MPM solution, which means that there is free energy that can flow from one BA to the other, and therefore you should test the competitiveness of the power balance constraint for these BAAs as a whole, as being in a group, so that essentially supply counterflow from one BAA could be considered when you are going to evaluate the competitiveness of these BAAs as a group. So that's a simple step. Then once you have this group of BAAs, you rank them and you sort them in the descending order of the marginal energy cost. Now you have a list of BAAs, of BAA groups that are separated price-wise on their marginal energy cost, and there is a significance to that. The top tier is import constrained from the remaining portion below, and that's why they have a higher marginal energy cost. And the bottom tier, of course, it's export constrained to the BA groups above, because it has the lower marginal energy cost. And if you're in the middle tier, essentially that middle tier is import constraint from below, export constraint from above. So you have this structure where you basically organize the groups by the marginal energy cost that gives you an idea about how competitive energy, if possible, can flow from one group to the other. And you're focusing, of course, on the groups that are import constrained, because that's what you want to test to make sure that there is sufficient competition in these BAA groups to meet their demand when import supply is no longer available after a transfer or a set of transfers across an interface hit the scheduling limit. So that's your step 2 that achieves this order. Okay, and then you start the algorithm by looking at your topmost group, right? You set this to be the current group. It's a recursive algorithm. So you start with that group. That's your group that has the highest marginal energy cost, and it's import constrained from every other group. You perform the RSI3 test, the resource efficiency. You calculate the resource efficiency supply index, for the 3 pivotal suppliers, the same test that we're using today. We're not proposing any change on that. And that test will tell you if the conditions for that BA group are competitive or not. If the RSI index comes to be 1 or higher, then you pass the test, you have sufficient competition. If it fails, if it's lower than 1, then it's considered to be uncompetitive, that BAA group. What's the consequence and the action on that? If the test passes, then all the BAAs in that group are marked competitive. And I'm saying in the algorithm unmarked BAAs, because you may have already, remember, this is recursive, it's going to go through multiple groups here. If you have already found in earlier steps that a BAA is competitive, it's marked as competitive. So after that, further tests with higher groups that include that BA, they're not going to change that status. So once a BA is found competitive, it stays competitive through the entire process. Similarly, if the test fails, any unmarked BAA in the group is now marked as uncompetitive, and that status also sticks with that BAA. If further group evaluations result in a pass for the RSI, that doesn't change the status for that BAA. So it's a single status evaluation for a BAA as you're going through this process. You're not flipping the status as you go along. You just focus into what happens with the BAAs that are evaluated for the first time, the unmarked ones. Also, if you pass the test, then what we're doing here is you calculate what we call the competitive LMP for that group that passes, and we use that competitive LMP in the mitigation of any BAAs in that group that have been marked to be uncompetitive and we have not mitigated them already. So of course we'll have examples to show those different scenarios, how they play out. So what is important to take away from this is that although there is multiple evaluations of a BAA being part of different groups, the assessment of whether it's competitive or uncompetitive is done the first time that is made, and it sticks to that BAA as a status. It doesn't change after that. And when you find a group that is competitive, that group now has a marginal energy cost that is used as the competitive LMP for the mitigation of all BAAs in that group that they were uncompetitive, that deemed uncompetitive in previous tests and have not been mitigated already. So basically the mitigation proceeds through steps. All right, so that's the result of the RSI test and how it's used. Then you move into the next step to either advance or change your grouping. So the first question you ask here is, are we done with this process? Have we included all the BAAs? If not, then we continue, and we have 3 questions to answer. The first thing that we make an assessment of is we look at the next higher priced BAA group. Remember, we have them ranked from top to bottom from high MEC to low MEC. So you look at your next group and you see if there is a direct connection of that next group with the current group that you were working on, that you evaluated. Direct connection means there is at least one transfer between the BAAs in that group directly with one or more BAAs in the current group. That's your direct connection. That means that there is a possibility for export from your current group to this next group, because the current group is import constrained, but it can export. And if that's the case, if you find a direct connection, then simply you merge this next higher price group with your current group, right? And then you return to step 4. Now you perform the RSI test for the expanded group, and you go on like that. Now you may find out that the next group is not directly connected with your current group, right? So now at this point you have to check whether it's connected with other groups that you tested previously, right? And if it's not, if it's the first time that you find this group in this process, then you switch your current group to this group and you go back to number 4. Now you're working with a new group. So the other scenario is you may find out that this next higher price group is actually connected to another group that you evaluated earlier in this process, but it's not your current group. Now you go and merge that to the previous group and you revert back to step 4, where you now evaluate this expanded group with the next higher price group. So as you walk through this process, essentially you're going through all your groups from top to bottom, structurally, expanding the group as you add BAAs that are BAA groups that are directly connected. And eventually you hit the point where you're going to start merging all these different branches into a single group, and you will expand this group until you eventually include all BAAs that you have in the market footprint, which would then come to the last point that you can't find any other group that you haven't addressed. So at this point, the algorithm stops. You can exit, but before you exit, you complete the mitigation step that you need to do, which is any uncompetitive BAAs in your entire group now that you haven't mitigated already in a previous step. Now you will have to mitigate them. And if you exit there by the last, this group was failing, the entire group of BAAs, so unlikely, but still in the algorithm it's possible, then you may have to mitigate without having a competitive LMP, because you never found a competitive LMP. That entire group was not competitive. So you can still mitigate the energy bids of resources for these BAAs that are marked uncompetitive and have not been mitigated already in this process. You mitigate the entire energy bid. There's no threshold anymore that represents the competitive LMP. You couldn't find one. We have some examples that will show that. So, of course, this may generate a lot of questions. I think it's better if we work through examples here to show how this plays out. That may answer most of your questions. I'll still ask if you have any questions, but I'm pretty sure that some of them will be answered when we go through the examples. But anyway, let's see if there are any burning questions here. Okay. And we will proceed and have some more discussion later on this. Brenda, if I advance the slides on my end, does this also show on the participants the advanced slide?
No, we can go ahead and pass presentation rights to you, George. Ahmed, can you go ahead and do that? Thank you.
So can you see slide 20 at this point?
We cannot. Let me make sure Ahmed is sending that over. He hasn't sent the presentation rights. Ahmed, can you go ahead and press? There you go. George, you could have it. Pass.
Okay.
We're on slide 20 now.
So you can see slide 20?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So there were some questions that they were submitted from stakeholders regarding the BA grouping proposal, and we will provide some answers here and perhaps have a discussion if the answer is not satisfactory. So the first question here that we want to address is, what is the logic that defines how competitive LMP is set? So as I described in the algorithm, as you walk through your tests of the different BA groups as they change, if the test is successful, then all these new BAs that you added that are unmarked, they're marked as competitive. And the marginal energy cost, which is the highest marginal energy cost in your group now, is the competitive LMP, because you have established that this particular group of BAAs that you just tested and passed is competitive. So therefore, the marginal energy cost of the last group that you added is a competitive LMP. So you're using now this competitive LMP in the mitigation of any BAAs in that group that they were previously found uncompetitive, and you have not mitigated them in earlier steps. Okay? And we'll see some examples on that. The other question is, when does this assessment stop? In some earlier discussions, the notion of stopping this process when you find a competitive group was considered, but it's not appropriate because in general you may have multiple different branches of group of BAs that you need to work all through. The fact that you find one group being competitive, you cannot stop the algorithm because there may be another branch that you're still working on, and there may still be BAAs that have not been tested as part of a group. So for simplicity and effectiveness and robustness, what we propose here is we continue this process all the way through, as you saw in the algorithm, until we have everything tested. So all BAAs in the last group, they're going to be tested. Of course, the expectation is that as you add BAAs, you make your groups bigger, you should find a grouping competitive. If you find one group competitive, you add more BAAs, you'll probably find the expanded group competitive, but that's not always the case, and it's not a certainty. So to be sure and have a robust algorithm here, what we're proposing is we continue doing this until we have all BAAs in the last group. We do one more test for the entire market footprint, and then we finish the algorithm this way. Let me see if there are any questions or discussion we need to have on these two elements before we go forward.
Let's go ahead and take Kelly Wells. Thank you.
Hey, George, it's Kelly Wells with WPTF again. Quick question. If you're adding, so let's say you're adding the last group into this grouping methodology, and they have a negative MEC because they're over-gen conditions, they're trying to export their generation out. Could you end up with a competitive LMP that's negative, and you're mitigating any other BAs that are now within that group that haven't been mitigated previously down to a negative value?
Yes, it's possible. So in a mathematical sense, the algorithm doesn't pay attention to what is the sign of the LMP, but you're right. If the LMP is negative for whatever reason for a BAA group that you add, and then the expanded group is competitive, it passes the RSI, that essentially says that competitive supply from this group that you added can actually meet the demand of the entire expanded group in a competitive fashion. So therefore, yes, your competitive LMP would be that negative, that negative LMP, which essentially says that you mitigate, if you have any energy bit mitigations to do, you essentially mitigate the entire bid. Anything that is above that competitive LMP.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I just want to make sure I understood that. Definitely something to think about, but I appreciate that clarification.
Sure. Do we have any more questions, Brenda?
No questions at this time.
All right. So I'm going to advance to slide 21, which I hope you can see on the screen now. Just checking. Yes?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, so another question that we wanted to address was, how does the assessment change if we assume KSO BAA is always competitive, which is the status quo at this point? So what we wanted to make sure here is that the proposal of this BAA grouping is not really dependent on the status quo in either way. So you can still follow the process that we described here, and whether you want to consider the ISO as always competitive or not is just an additional attribute, if you wish, on the algorithm. And how we can achieve the status quo, if we ever want to do that, which will be a subject for discussion in the next stakeholder call. There are two options that we can see that we can bring this home if we want to go that way. One option is when we make the assessment of a BAA group and the ISO is in that group, was recently added, and the group is not competitive, which means that we mark all the BAAs, all the new BAAs in that group as non-competitive. We simply override that, saying that no, the ISO is competitive, and we mark it as competitive. That's one way. The other way is we expand this a little bit more and say, well, if the ISO is competitive, if it's in the same group with other BAAs, remember the original grouping, the same MEC, then we say that any group that the ISO is part is competitive. So the original group that may have the ISO and other BAAs in it because they have the same MEC, we say that entire group is competitive. And whenever we add that group to other groups for performing the test, we continue saying that this group is competitive. So, and every time we perform this test where we expand the group, right? We add new BAAs and the expanded group has the ISO in it, then we'll say, okay, this group is de facto competitive because it has the ISO in it, and we don't even do the testing. So we can skip the RSI test whenever the group includes the ISO by making the assumption, for better or worse, that the ISO is always competitive and makes everything around it competitive too. So these are these two options. Again, we will discuss them, their merits, in the next workshop. So I don't think we should start discussing them in this particular call today. The other question is, and I think I answered it a little bit in the description of the algorithm. What does constitute a direct transfer connection? Because it's an element that affects how the algorithm performs, right? This is the topological element that I mentioned earlier, which makes the algorithm complicated. So the definition of a direct transfer connection is the fact that there is a transfer, at least one transfer that's established between the two BAA groups. And that transfer does not have to be between adjoining BAAs, actually. It doesn't have to be on a direct intertie between the BAAs because we can establish transfers when there are rights that are used for the transfer that are going through another BAA, and that other BAA could be in the market footprint, or it could even be outside the market footprint. For example, in EIM, before Bonneville Power Administration joined the EIM, we had transfers between Portland General Electric and the ISO. PGE was using rights through the BPA to connect with the ISO. So although ISO and PGE are not adjoining, we had a transfer. So that fills in, satisfies the definition of a direct transfer between a group that would include PGE and a group that would include the ISO. Okay. Another question here, and this came from DMM, I believe. How are the supply and demand for counterflow calculated in a specific RSI? And we have some examples to show that. But the answer is really the simplest way I can describe this, which is also the robust way, because there are different ways where you consider in the numerator and the denominator of the RSI ratio. But the result is the same if you take something from the denominator, you put in the numerator, or the other way around. But the simplest way that I found to be robust and effective and always true is you count for the supply counterflow the contributions from all resources except load. And that includes transfers, imports, and exports. And transfers, imports, and exports are fringe competitive supply because we always assume that there is so much supply available from different participants at interties, either through a transfer or through the import, right, that they're competitive. Of course, when you have intertie constraints like in the ISO specifically, ISLs or ITCs, you have to take that into consideration, the fact that you have all this available supply and interties. That doesn't mean that it's all effective. So it's only what the ITC can accommodate, which essentially strips out any participant on the other side. You're looking for the bulk of energy that can be imported to a BAA group through imports and exports. Now for EDM BAAs or EIM BAAs, imports, exports are self-schedules, they don't have bids. So it's still a fringe competitive supply at whatever is the self-schedule that cleared the NPM pass. For the ISO specifically, imports, exports can have bids. So you can consider them as part of the RSI calculation as fringe competitive supply. But again, you're looking at the maximum net import, right? Because you can net all of them. There's the maximum net import that can be accommodated by your ITC constraints that affects your RSI because it meets portion of your demand. And then that leaves in the demand for counterflow only the load. That's in the denominator. And for the IFM NPM test, that load is the scheduled load in the NPM pass. For rack and real time, it's the demand forecast. Okay, so that makes it clear on how we calculate the RSI. Specifically for transfers, there are no bids on transfers, right? They're scheduled optimally, and similar to what we do today in EIM, for the calculation of the impact of a transfer on the RSI through this process that we described here, you consider the transfer fixed at whatever was scheduled in the NPM pass. But again, as a fringe competitive supply, it still meets or offsets your load. So we'll see how this plays out in some examples. Let me see if there are any questions on or discussions on these answers that we provide at this point.
We can take Mike from CDS Associates.
Hey, George, it's Mike Castellano. How are you doing?
Hi, Mike.
So my question, I'm trying to think through this in terms of calculating the demand for counterflow. So say you've got a group of 5 BAAs. So
yes,
the demand for counterflow is going to be, is it the sum of the load in all 5 of those?
Yes, specifically for the IFM, that would be the scheduled load in all of these BAAs in that group.
Okay,
That's
and then what's the supply of counterflow in that case?
It's all your internal supply in that group, okay? And of course, it's separated to fringe and potential pivotal supply. We'll see the formula next, but it's all the supply, including any transfers from BAAs outside that group, and any imports, net imports into that group from non-EDAM BAAs if we're in EDAM outside of that group, of course.
Okay. So this is sort of like, instead of testing an individual constraint here, you're going to be essentially testing like the group of kind of like this, okay, the sum of the transfer constraints into that group, more or less, as a set.
It is a constraint. What you're testing is the power balance for the entire group, because the power balance constraint, although we applied for each BAA, if we group the BAs, what you're testing is the power balance for the entire group of BAA. So any transfers between BAs in that group, they cancel out, obviously. So essentially, you're saying, is there enough competitive supply in the entire BA, in the entire group, and coming from outside, that can meet your scheduled load in the group without having to rely on accepting bids from the 3 pivotal suppliers. That's your test, basically. So you're testing the power balance constraint for the entire group.
And then in terms of calculating pivotal suppliers, are there going to be any exclusions on who can be counted as a pivotal supplier?
Yeah, so there is an assessment that determines whether a supplier being an SC affiliate is potentially pivotal if it ranks in the 3 highest suppliers that they're ranked in terms of what we call the potential to withhold supply counterflow. And in the example that we'll show, we'll explain that. Now, there are some further discussion that we're going to have in the next call or in the future, where earlier proposals would qualify certain elements in that determination. Specifically, if an SC affiliate contributes to the supply counterflow only for the excess of supply than the load that they have to meet. That's one. But what we do today in EIM, we don't have this modification. Today, we basically calculate the vanilla potential for supply counterflow, and the three top ISC affiliates form the pivotal supplier group for the calculation of the resource supply index. But yes, there is a possibility to make some changes to that, subject to discussion in future calls.
Okay, I think that answers my question. Thanks, George.
You're welcome. Is there another question?
No more questions, George.
Okay, so we advance to slide 22. Oh, okay, so we're going to go through the examples. And our first example here shows a situation where essentially provides a justification for the proposal. Why do we want to group BAAs and test them as a group? And the reason is that if there is competitive supply that's available from one BAA to meet the demand in another BAA, by testing the BAAs individually, you essentially don't take that into consideration and makes the RSI test more stringent for the BAA if you test it on its own. So it is possible that if you perform that test in this way, and this is what we do today in the EIM, you may find that the BAA fails the test, whereas if you group it with another BAA, and you test the group, you may find that the group passes. And this is an example that shows that we have two BAAs, A and B. There are 4 resources and a load in its BAA. And you see here the bids and the supply. Assume that the load is self-scheduled, 100 megawatts in BAA and 500 megawatts in BAA-B. And in its BAA, you have suppliers by size. You'll see in BAA-A, G1, G2, and G3, and assume that there are no affiliates here. HSC is non-affiliated for its generator here. So these 3 generators, 1, 2, and 3, they have the highest capacity, okay? And assume that all generators here are flexible, there are no intertemporal constraints, there are no self-schedules, so they can actually withhold completely. So obviously the 3 largest generators in each BAA constitute your potential pivotal suppliers. So in BAA is G1, 2, and 3. G4 is a fringe competitive supplier. And in BAA-B, 5, 6, and 7 are the potential pivotal suppliers. And G8 is a fringe competitive supplier. And as you can see, to meet the load of 500 megawatts in BAA-B, you will use all the bids available in BAA-B, and you still need another 100 megawatts. So there will be a 100 megawatt transfer from A to B that will clear your MPM pass. Okay. And now we're going to do the exercise of calculating the resource supply index, first separately for each BAA, and then as a group, right? This transfer of 100 megawatts, it doesn't hit any scheduling limit, okay? So essentially your marginal energy cost is going to be the same for these 2 BAAs set by G4, right, at $50. So they have the same MEC. So according to the proposal here for grouping BAAs, this will be grouped, all right, because they have the same MEC. So we're going to actually test them as a group. But what happens if we test them individually? I'm also listing here the formula for the resource supply index. In the denominator, you have the demand for counterflow, which is the scheduled load. So in each BAA, it's 100 and 500, in the group 600, right? And in the numerator, you have the supply counterflow, which in this case is really the supply. And you separate that to two pieces, right? The supply from the fringe competitive suppliers, that's FCS, and the supply from potential pivotal suppliers. Okay, these are your three largest suppliers. And in the numerator, you're taking the maximum supply counterflow, so the maximum supply from fringe competitive suppliers, minus the lowest supply counterflow, the lowest supply, from the pivotal suppliers. Essentially, what you're trying to find out is if the three potential pivotal suppliers withhold the maximum supply counterflow, can we still meet the demand for counterflow relying on the maximum supply that we can get from the fringe competitive suppliers? So that's what the test does. So let's perform this test now for the BAAs. For BAA, the fringe competitive supply is from G4 at 210 megawatts, all right? And there is an export of a transfer for 100 megawatts, so that reduces the supply counterflow by 100. And then on the other side, we subtract the minimum supply counterflow from the three potential pivotal suppliers, G1, G2, and G3, and we assume that they can withhold all their bid. So the minimum is 0. And in the denominator, you have the 100 megawatt scheduled load. So that ratio for BAA is above 1 because you have 110 over 100, right? So that says that BAA is competitive, which means we can serve the demand in BAA solely relying on G4, which is the fringe competitive supplier, without being forced to accept any bid from the three pivotal suppliers. That's why it's competitive, right? The three pivotal supplier test, economic theory suggests to go with three pivotal suppliers in the test because experience and practical information shows that up to three suppliers could potentially successfully collude in a market, whereas beyond that, it's very unlikely. So that's why we cut it to three potential suppliers if somebody had this question. Let's perform the same test for BAAB. Your fringe competitive supplier is G8, the smaller of the four, right? So if we take all the supply from G8, all right, plus whatever is coming through the transfer, that's also fringe competitive supply, all right, so we have 150. If everybody else withholds, all the three pivotal suppliers withhold, can we meet the 500 load? We cannot. This ratio is less than 1. It's 150 over 500, which says that we cannot meet the load in BAAB without accepting bids from the three pivotal suppliers. So therefore, according to this test, BAAB is uncompetitive. What would happen if we merge this, as in this proposal, into a group and we test the entire group? Let's have a look at the group. You can see that the three pivotal suppliers in the group are still G1, G2, and G3. Those are the largest generators. But now you have more fringe competitive suppliers. G6, 5, and 7, they are fringe competitive suppliers now in the group. So if we add all the supply from fringe competitive suppliers, 210 from G4, 150 from G5, 120 from G7, 80 from G6, and 50 from G8, all right? The transfer doesn't matter anymore because it's internal. We actually take the supply at the resources, so it cancels out export from one BA, import to the other, so it doesn't matter in the group. Do we have enough to meet the entire schedule load in the group, which is 100 plus 500? That ratio is 610 over 600. It's bigger than 1, so now the group is competitive, meaning we can meet the demand in the group without having to rely to bids from the three largest suppliers, G1, G2, and G3, that we can assume that they could potentially fully withhold, right? So this is an example that shows that testing BAAs individually may not be accurate in their determination of whether they're competitive or not, because you simply do not consider the fact that there could be competitive supply that can be imported if there is no limit on the transfer. If there was a limit on the transfer, then obviously the price will separate, and you'll have BAA be at a higher MEC than BAA, so you wouldn't group them at the get-go. You'll group them at the later stages when you expand that group. So this is why we believe that this methodology can more accurately assess the competitiveness of a BAA through this grouping method. Let me stop here and see if there are any questions to this.
We have J.K. Wang. Let's go take her question, and please be sure to introduce yourself.
Hi, this is J.K. Wang from PGE. And thanks, George, for this example. This is really helpful, very clear. I have a question regarding the way that we calculate RSI for BA1 and B and C. I understand fully when you explain when we subtract and add 100 as a transfer in these equations. I'm just wondering if I'm looking at the formulation listed in the middle there, where does this 100 belong to? Does that belong to the first term or the second term? I'm trying to fit it in the formulation here.
Yeah, it belongs to the supply counterflow from fringe competitive suppliers. Anything that comes from imports through an intertie, whether it's an import from outside the market footprint or a transfer from inside the market footprint, is considered fringe competitive supply. Essentially, the assumption is that there is available supply that is competitive on interties for a BAA.
I see. Okay, so it's part of the supply, and the reasons being that we subtract 100 from the 210 is because we have export 100 megawatt to BAB. Okay, and I'm just curious for the BAB calculation here. I understand the logic is the same, that we have these imports 100 megawatts, but why we assume it is competitive instead of counting it as one of the pivotal suppliers?
Because we assume that there is enough supply in the BAAs that provide this import to consider it competitive. In fact, in this case, it's provided by G4, which is a fringe competitive supplier, but you don't actually see it. In this example, it's evident, but in general, if you have a 100 megawatt import at an intertie, that 100 megawatt import could be a schedule that cleared out of multiple bids with a lot higher capacity than 100 megawatts that they competed through a potential intertie schedule or not. That's all what was available. But you always assume that today, at least that's the assumption we're using, that it is a competitive supply if it's bid on an intertie, because anyone from outside can bid on that intertie, and then they all compete to get through any constraint on the intertie that we have. And that's the reason why we don't today mitigate import bids at the ISO balancing authority area. We consider all imports to be competitive, fringe competitive supply, essentially. So we extend the concept here to any supply that would be fixed coming on an intertie to an EDAM BAA, for example, because there are no bids for EDAM BAAs on imports, and the same for the transfer. So this is really a fixed quantity here. The maximum is the same as what's scheduled in the NPM pass, which is 100 megawatt. And you can take it from the right-hand side of this of this and put it on the denominator, you can say, well, I have 210 megawatt of supply to meet a total of 100 megawatt load plus 100 megawatt export. So you can consider the 100 as part of the denominator. You can do that. That doesn't change the test, the outcome of the test. It's still competitive for A and uncompetitive for B.
Right,
it's just
right.
another way
Yeah,
of,
I see that. Yeah, it doesn't change the results, but I'm just curious because the way that we cut it in, I appreciate the way you explain the economics meaning behind it, and I agree with it. It's just when we look at the formulation itself, you know, how physically it's constructed, it seems the 100 imported into the BAB could be a pivotal supply just because its marginal price is $50 and it's above the generator 6.
Indeed.
Yeah, I agree with you. It doesn't change the outcome though.
No, it's okay to answer that question. It could clear the NPM pass coming from an SC affiliate of, let's say, G5. In which case you say, wait a moment, you say 100 megawatts is a fringe competitive supplier, but it's really the SC for it. If it's an import, not a transfer, it's difficult to track the transfer, but let's say it's an import. Let's say the BAB is an ISO BAA and we have imports. So this 100 megawatt cleared at an import. And it so happened that the SC for it is in the same affiliate with one of your pivotal suppliers for the ISO BAA, right? So you say, okay, how can you consider this fringe competitive supply? That's your question. And it's a good question to ask. And the answer is, well, you know what? That was not the only bid that cleared at that intertie. You had a whole bunch of bids that they were competing, and based on the price, yeah, that specific SC cleared. But you know what? It's still fringe competitive supply because you can ignore which is the SC, and you say, I can get 100 megawatt of imports because that's what is my constraint. That's what I can import. And you know, I don't have to get that specific SC that is in the affiliate of G5, which is a pivotal supplier. Any other SC could select. Essentially, there is so much competition at the intertie that what can clear is really SC agnostic, is a fringe competitive supply. One SC can substitute for another. So essentially, the SC affiliate of G5 that includes that SC bid on the import doesn't have to clear that import, it has to compete with other bids. So that's why we, instead of saying we got 100 megawatt bid from that SC, let's say SC5, we say, well, we just got 100 megawatt of competitive import supply. So we are SC agnostic for it. We say it's fringe competitive supply. One SC can substitute for the other. I hope this is a satisfactory answer why we considered
It does, and I appreciate all of the insights you provided. It's really helpful. Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Thank you.
Alva, you're next, and then we have Mike and VJ. Thank you.
Great, George. This is an excellent example. I mean, I sort of want to go back to the example of BAAB just to double check. So basically, suppose that you had requirements for imbalance reserves, for example, that constrain what was being supplied in the NPM run from the internal resources. And the feasible solution was one that pulled in, rather than 100 megawatts, 550 megawatts of supply from BAA. That 550 then would cause BAAB to be marked as competitive under this test. Am I understanding that correctly? That if there was that amount of transfer capability and the NPM solution pulled that amount of energy into BAAB, then that would BAAB, by virtue of that, would pass the test, would be considered competitive.
Yes, because essentially it will say that you have sufficient fringe competitive supply from an import to meet the demand in BAAB without relying on any bid from the three largest potential pivotal suppliers.
Pivotal suppliers
So
in BAAB,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Again, you
Yes.
have that counterintuitive result where you've got the actually more expensive supply might be setting the price and coming from elsewhere. And in fact, there could be market power there, but it's not going to register in terms of the marking of resources in BAAB in that case.
Right. You'll find that out when you test A and B together and see if there's still competitive supply that can meet the schedule's load and any requirements for imbalance reserves, since you bring it up, on the group. So it will show there at the group assessment.
I mean, you could construct an example where that would be coming from because that would be coming from the big three in BAA. It wouldn't change anything in terms of BAA plus BAAB either. So it'd be competitive in both.
In this particular example, it so happens that 1, 2, and 3, although they're the largest suppliers, they cannot exercise market power on the group of A and B. Another example with different numbers could show something different. Could show that when you group A and B, it's still non-competitive, in which case BAB would not get any benefit.
Right.
But certainly there's a benefit here if BAB is merged with BAA and you have no sufficient fringe competitive supply in the group to meet the load of the group.
Now, one question I have is, doesn't there have to be a check on the flow capability between the two areas for this test to work? I mean, it seems to me like if the transfer capability is 200 megawatts, you can't really be doing the test this way because you can't supply in the way that you're thinking you can supply from the larger entities in BAA to the big load in BAAB, right?
Right, and if there were a constraint like that, and it shows that you hit it in the NPM pass, that will separate the BAA prices and you wouldn't group them on the get-go. If the constraint, if they have the same price, that means they're still connected, there's still supply that can cross, but yes, you say, well, maybe there is very small additional supply that can, but it doesn't matter because for the evaluation, we consider the transfer to be fixed at what's solved at the NPM pass.
And you can't see that coming up because of this cascading grouping either. So it should be going in the right direction where you're not gonna.
Yes, the only way you can see it, if you have import bids, so specifically for the ISO, it's something that we considered and discussed I mean, it's been a few years now in the System Market Power Mitigation Initiative when we were making these discussions, is that when you consider imports, yes, they're fringe competitive supply, so they go in this FCS addition. You may have a lot of capacity under an import bid on our interties for the California ISO BAA. That doesn't mean all of it is effective because it has to compete through the constraints, through our ITCs. So in this evaluation, you have to be careful not to blindly consider all the import bids and then say, okay, I'm going to get the maximum of that because it's fringe competitive supply, because that maximum may exceed what you actually can import. So you have to have that constraint in mind and really put in this formula your maximum that can be accommodated by your import constraints, your ITCs. And that's why when I was responding earlier,
that really has to be detected by the price is the flag for that in this algorithm, basically. That's going to tell you whether you can supply or not. Whether there's a constraint on the flow between the two areas. That's what you were.
Right, and if that constraint materializes in the NPM pass, then obviously you have price separation between the BAAs. So you won't group them anyway.
Is it possible there's intermediate points though, where like you haven't hit the transfer capability, the prices are the same in the NPM run, but then when you do this grouping, you're overestimating how much you can get from one BAA to the other?
Not if you limit your your supply counterflow from imports to your constraint. So, for example, let's say you have 200 megawatt import bid, and you have only 100 megawatt import capability. In your fringe competitive supply input for the RSI, you won't put 200 megawatts because you can only import 100 megawatts. So your maximum supply counterflow from import will be 100 megawatts.
Okay.
And if you reflect that there, obviously you won't tilt the RSI calculation to something that is not feasible.
In this case, the 210 is actually limited not only by the resource G4, but also by the transfer capability. In other words, if the transfer capability were if the transfer capability were 190, then you wouldn't have 210 in that formula. In the last formula, you'd put 190 rather than 210.
It's not the 210. The 210 is still 210 because you can still, this says how much supply you can get from this fringe supplier, and that's 210 is the maximum.
Okay.
It's the 100 in blue that factors in and say, okay, how much of that supply really is not staying in BAAA, but is going out, and that's a 100 megawatt transfer, so that's where you subtract it. Either that, or you go to the denominator and say, well, I'm not trying to meet 100 megawatt of load, but really 100 megawatt of load plus 100 megawatt exports. So whether you consider in the numerator or the denominator, it's a choice. And I always find it more robust and efficient to do it in the numerator because it may not be a fixed supply. It may have a bid, in which case now you have to take the maximum of that constrained by your import capability, or in this case, your export capability.
Okay, but suppose that there was only 100, that the remaining transfer capability was just say 50 megawatts more could be sent across the tie. You don't show that anywhere in this formula, but that's the most additional you can get actually to supply BAAB. It doesn't seem to come into this anywhere. That effectively that would seem like the BAAB there would still be the same kind of market power there was in the previous test.
But you're using the 100 as a fixed quantity. You don't say, okay,
Right.
there is another 50 megawatt room, so I'm going to use 150. So that's not what we're doing today. We're fixing the transfer to what's sold in the MPM. So if 100 was possible and didn't create price separation, then 100 is used in the RSI. The fact that there is a 150 megawatt capability doesn't affect because it was not scheduled in the MPM. So you make the assumption that, oh, if you didn't make the MPM, you won't make the IFM. So basically you have the assumption in place here. Of course, your MPM analysis is based on the MPM solution, and that doesn't guarantee your IFM solution will be the same. Obviously it will be different, but that's what we base it for. We base it at the MPM solution, so you assume that the transfers that are clearing the MPM, they're staying fixed, and you consider them fixed in the RSI evaluation. So if there is additional capability that was not used, it doesn't factor in. It only factors if you have a bid, as I mentioned for the ISO intertie import bids. If you have 100 megawatt import that clear the MPM, but there's another 50 megawatt import capability, and there are bids out there for that, then in your RSI for the ISO, you'll use 150 as supply counterflow from imports because it's fringe competitive supply, because there you have a bid.
It just, it's just strange because it looks almost obvious in this particular case that the suppliers in BAAB still have market power. That's the thing that's confusing to me. But thank you for going through the example. I don't want to belabor it.
Next, we do have Mike. If we can make the questions brief and professional, thank you so much.
Yes. So one thing, just real quick, I'll say about Alva's question. I think something to think through there is George is showing this example of the group. And if there was market power being exercised in BAAB, it potentially would have been mitigated already before we got to this group because it would have had a higher MEC in a previous step. So that could change some of what was going on there. I'm not sure exactly how, but I think there is an additional element that would come into play. And sort of along similar lines, George, if we have one BAA, like just imagine BAA B in this situation, everybody bid $100. And so BAA B gets hit for mitigation. Do we redispatch and reprice in any way before we do this group test? I'm trying to think of whether we need to or not, or.
Yeah, no, because first of all, it wouldn't be practical, but I don't think you even need it. Our mitigation tests are all based on the result of a single market power pass, which is a try run for the market with unmitigated bids to see what you get. So based on that run and those schedules and solutions and prices, then you perform all this analysis that we're describing here. The fact that you mitigate the bids in a BAA in this process, you're asking the question, well, can we go back and rerun MPM with the mitigated bids and see the effect of these bids before we proceed? Obviously, that would be prohibitive in terms of performance, and it really also does not provide any insight that you're doing the mitigation more accurately or less accurately. It doesn't really tell you that this would be more accurate to do. So
Okay.
we don't have a clear gain for the performance hit.
Okay, thanks, George.
And then lastly, we do have Vijay. Go ahead, Vijay. Please be sure to introduce yourself.
Hey, this is Vijay from Pacificor. Thanks, George, for the examples and discussion. It's really helpful. Just a quick question here. Can you please explain again why the minimum supply for counterflow from pivotal suppliers in BAA-B is 0 for just the individual test on BAA-B? I think I just missed that.
Oh, yes. So we assumed here for the simplicity of the example that there are no self-schedules, they're just bids from these resources. And we assume that they're flexible resources, that they don't have intertemporal constraints, so you can actually set them down. So that says that these pivotal suppliers, they can withhold the entire capacity that they provided as a bid in the market. So that's why 0 is the minimum supply counterflow. In reality, the way we calculate this and the way we perform the RSI index, we do take into consideration any obvious resource constraints that would limit the ability to withhold. For example, if you have a self-schedule, let's say G5 has a self-schedule at 60 megawatts and then an additional bid on top of it. Yes, they can withhold the bid, but they cannot withhold the 60 megawatt self-schedule. So the minimum supply counterflow for them as a potential pivotal supplier would be 60 megawatts. Another example that I can give you, MPM solve and awarded spin, let's say, to G5. Again, having a spin award, that doesn't mean the market can shut you down. You have to be online to provide the spin. So if your minimum load is 30 megawatts, all right, you can only withhold 30 megawatts plus your spin award. So your minimum is not 0. So we take that into consideration. Of course, this is a little bit in the weeds, so I didn't want to bring it up. So that's why for the example, I assumed no capacity awards, flexibility, you don't have minimum load, your minimum load is 0, you can shut down, there are no intertemporal constraints, therefore you can withhold fully, right? But in reality, we take this under consideration.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for that.
Any other questions?
No more questions, George.
Thank you. All right, let's go and see how this algorithm is performed, having an example here. So just a general example, you have a set of balancing authority areas. I believe there are 9 of them in all, arranged in some network configuration. You can show the direct connections there being transfers between them. And let's say that you have a situation where some of these transfers are at their scheduling limit in the MPM solution, so you see the price separation because of that. Remember our steps in our algorithm. First, we group BAAs that are at the same marginal energy cost. So BAA3 and BAA4, they're grouped at $25. 7 and 9, they're grouped at $12. 6 and 8 at $10. And then we rank them top to bottom based on their MEC. So BAA1 ranks highest at $30, and then you go down to the rest, ending at 6 and 8 at $10. Okay. So your grouping steps, as you go through this, BAA1 is your first group, right, at $30. Then the next lowest is $25. So the next step goes to BAAs 3 and 4 together. We don't merge that with BAA1 because there's no direct transfer with BAA1. So they're staying individually as a group. And then comes BAA2 at $20. That does have a direct connection with BAA1. So BAA2 will be grouped with BAA1. So that's the third group that we have, right? 1 and 2. Again, we don't merge this with 3 and 4, although 3 and 4, they have higher MEC, $25 than the $20, because there's no direct transfer between 3, 4, and 2 and 1, right? But then when the next step brings into the picture BAA5 at $15, BAA5 has direct connections with all the previous groups, so now everything comes together, and at that step, your BA group is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? All of those. The next step will bring in 7 and 9. So that group expands the previous one with 7 and 9. And at the end, you have the total group of all BAAs in together, right? So you have these 6 grouping steps. And then in the next set of examples, we'll walk with these steps and see several scenarios of how the mitigation assessment will be performed. But let me pause for a moment and see if there are any questions on this grouping, if this is clear how these grouping steps work, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6.
If there's any questions, please use the raise hand icon located above the chat window. But I don't see any questions for you, George, at this time.
Thank you, Brenda. All right, let's go to example 1 is one scenario here, okay? And let's say, according to our grouping steps, remember in the previous thing, BAA1 was in the top, right? It was the first group. So the first test we do is for BAA1 on its own, okay? Because it's a $30 on its own. And let's say that the test fails for BAA1, all right? So now we mark BAA1 as uncompetitive. And that will not change as we proceed through this process where BAA1 will be eventually grouped with other BAAs and maybe that group becomes competitive. That doesn't change the competitiveness of BAA1. It stays as uncompetitive. So we will mitigate BAA1, but we don't do it at this step because we don't know yet what is the competitive LMP to use in that mitigation. So we proceed. Next step, right, it's the group of 3 and 4. Let's say we perform the test for that group 3 and 4 and it passes. And here's the example that we had earlier where we said, well, if we had tested BA4 alone, maybe it would fail, but testing the 3 and 4 together, you have a pass. So that's where you get a little bit more accurate mitigation by grouping BAs at the same price. All right, so now BAAs 3 and 4, they're marked as competitive, and that is going to stick with them. If later on they're grouped with another group of BAAs and that expanded group fails, we don't go back and say that 3 and 4 are uncompetitive. They stay competitive because they are competitive on their own, okay? So once you assess a BAA, that assessment stays throughout this process. Fine, so now we go to step 3, where we're testing 1 and 2 together. Remember that was our group at that stage. And let's say 1, 2 fail. So adding BA2 to BA1, that didn't change it. The group still failed. So now we mark BA2 as uncompetitive, and we need to mitigate both 1 and 2, but we don't do it yet because we don't have a competitive LMP yet. So we go to the next step where we bring in 5, and now we have the group of 1 through 5, all of it. And let's say that the test for this group passes. All right, since it passes, BAA5, which was the one that we added, is marked as competitive. All right, and now we have a competitive LMP because of BAA5. That's $15. Right? So we use the competitive LMP of $15 for mitigating the previously marked uncompetitive BAAs that we haven't mitigated yet, namely 1 and 2. So now we go back to 1 and 2 that we said we need to mitigate. We have the competitive LMP of $15, so we'll go ahead and mitigate those. All right. Then we continue with the algorithm. The next group includes 7 and 9. All right. Let's say that this passes. Okay. So 7 and 9 are competitive. And then the last step, we add 6 and 8. I'll say, okay, the whole group now, the whole market footprint is passing, so also 6 and 8 are competitive. And now we can exit because we mitigated the ones that we needed to mitigate, 1 and 2. So there's no other task that we need to perform, and this is the scenario in example 1. Again, let's pause for questions, make sure that this is understood.
Yes, George. We do have J.K. Wang, so let's go ahead and take her question.
Hi, George. I have a quick clarification question for your step 3. So when BAA1 and 2 fail, when mitigated BAA2, I understand that. I'm thinking, what does that mean exactly? So when BA1 fail, let's assume it's a pivotal suppliers or generator 1, 2, and 3, and there are also 3 pivotal generators in BA2 alone. Let's call them generator 4, 5, 6. However, for the group of BA1 and 2, the pivotal generators are 2, 3, and 5. So the intersect set of this is generator 5 in BA2. So when you say we only mitigated BA2, do we mitigate generator 4, 5, and 6, or only generator 5?
So the vanilla proposal says all energy bits need to be mitigated, having an LMPM aside here. There may be additional implications, the way we're discussing a little bit earlier on how this jives with LMPM mitigation, or what happens with the deployment scenarios for imbalances. We will address this complexity a little bit later. Let's keep it simple here. Let's say we're focusing on the energy commodity from the base scenario in the IFM. Let's narrow it down. So if a BAA is found to be uncompetitive, in this case 1 and 2, then we mitigate all energy bids for every supply resource in those BAAs, unless they're specifically exempted from market power mitigation. There are some resources that are exempted. And right, so even if you are a fringe competitive supplier, you're still mitigated. All right. There is an element additional to the proposal. So this is the vanilla proposal, right? This is the status quo. That's what we do in EIM. Now, there is a discussion we'll run in a future call, or there's a proposal that says when you go and mitigate the bids in a BAA that is found to be uncompetitive, only mitigate the pivotal suppliers. And I'm not saying the 3 pivotal suppliers, any supplier that is found to be pivotal. The rationale there says that, well, if the supplier is not pivotal, meaning you can do without its bid, you don't need to select this bid, they can bid whatever they want. You don't rely on their bid. If they're not pivotal, okay, and there's a way to find out if they're pivotal or not, then why mitigate them? Just leave them alone. So that is an additional aspect on the proposal that we can consider and discuss in future calls. But for the time being, the vanilla proposal is yes, if a BAA is found to be uncompetitive, then you mitigate all the energy bids of supply resources that are subject to mitigation.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
There's no more questions for you, George, at this time.
Thank you. Let's go to example 2, which is another scenario. We're still using the same system. So in this scenario, BAA1 still fails the test, so we mark it as uncompetitive. 3 and 4 still pass, same as before, so they're competitive. All right. And 1, 2 fail, same as before, so we need to mitigate BAA2 is uncompetitive. And now we add 5, bring the entire group together, and in this scenario, that group fails. Okay. Now we don't go back and say 3 and 4 and changing the status. They're competitive. They were found competitive in stage 2. The fact that later on we group them with 5, 1, and 2, and the expanded group, fails the RSI, we don't go back and say, oh, 3 and 4 are not competitive. They are competitive on their own. They just, their competitive supply, when you consider the entire group, is not enough to change the expanded group to make it competitive. But they are competitive on their own. But the remaining 1, 2, and 5, they're uncompetitive. So now we need to mitigate 5 in the scenario as well. So we're looking for a competitive LMP. To do that, we have to proceed with the algorithm. We bring in 7 and 9 now in step 5. And now the entire group 1, 5, 7, 9, 1 through 5, 7, and 9, let's say it passes. Well, now we do have a competitive LMP. That's $12, right? From 7 and 9 we brought in. And now we're going to use this $12 competitive LMP for mitigating everything that was marked uncompetitive, 1, 2, and 5. Okay. And then the last step, we bring in 6 and 8, everything, and let's say it passes. So we're done. Any questions on this scenario?
I don't see any more questions right now, George.
Okay. Right. So this we're exploring different possibilities to understand how this process would work. Example 3 is another scenario. It's a little bit, now we'll start making them a little bit more complex. So BA1 still fails, mitigate BA1. In this one, in this scenario, 3 and 4 fail as well. So now we mitigate also 3 and 4. Okay. We continue the algorithm. Now we merge 2, 2, 1, and let's say 1, 2 pass. Here's a scenario with 1 was uncompetitive. All right. Then we merge with 2. The group is competitive, so now BAA2 is marked as competitive. 1 is still uncompetitive because it's not competitive on its own. So we still need to mitigate 1. Now that the group A1 and 2 pass, we do have a competitive LMP at $20 to use it for mitigating BAA1. Okay. We don't use that for mitigating 3 and 4 because they're not grouped together yet. Okay, but we use the $20 to mitigate BA1 bids. All right, then we'll continue the algorithm. We'll bring in 5. Let's say that the entire group of 1 and 5 fails. So we need to mitigate BA5, right? Okay, we still don't have a competitive LMP for that. And also for 3 and 4 because they failed in the scenario. So we proceed. We'll bring in now 7 and 9 into the entire group here on the right side. And let's say this big group passes. Now we do have a competitive LP of $12, which we'll use to mitigate everything that was marked uncompetitive so far and has not been mitigated, namely 3, 4, and 5. So we'll mitigate the bids in this BAS using the competitive LMP of $12. So as you can see, you can have different competitive LMPs for different mitigations as the process going through, and that's what I wanted to show you in the scenario. So for 1, you use $20 as a competitive LMP for its mitigation. For 3, 4, and 5, you're using $12 as a competitive LMP. It's lower because you go lower on the 3. And let's say on the last step, when you bring 6 and 8, everything passes, so no more mitigation. Okay. Let's see if there are any questions on this a little bit more complicated scenario.
Okay, we do have Mike. Let's go ahead and unmute Mike from GDS Associates.
George,
yes, Mike.
So in step 4, I guess I'm confused with why BAA5 is at $12 instead of the $20 that might come from step 4.
Oh, that's because there is an import constraint going to BAA2 from BA5. That's why the price separates between BAA2 and BA5. BA5 is at $15, BA2 is at $20 because there is a constraint in the transfer, sending energy from 5 to 2.
Okay.
All right. Right. So
You're-
your question is, why don't you use the $20 to mitigate BA5 as the
Yeah, so-
competitive LMP?
Yeah.
All right.
So
Because
you're
$20 is not, yeah, $20 is not competitive for 5, right? Because when you add 5, the group is uncompetitive here. So you don't have a competitive LMP yet. You can't say $20 is competitive for this group. $20 is competitive for the group BAA1 and BAA2, but not for the rest. You have to go lower in your process to find a group that passes, that is competitive, and pick up the MEC from that group to mitigate BA5, 3, and 4.
Oh, okay, I got you.
Right.
Thanks, George.
I do have one more. John, go ahead. Introduce yourself. John, we can't hear you. I think your audio is not there. Just make sure you're not double muted on your headset. If not, we can
Yeah.
also.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Yes, now we can.
Great, thanks. John from SE. George, thanks for this example. Really helpful. I just wanted to see whether or not you could provide more context on regarding default energy bids and how this all plays with this grouping methodology.
There's actually no connection because this grouping methodology simply assesses whether we need to mitigate the bids in a BA or not. Now, the next step, when you go and mitigate, all right, which is based on this assessment as it's made from this algorithm, at that step, when you go to a specific energy bid from a specific resource that you look to mitigate, then you have two pieces of information. You have the competitive LMP that comes from this algorithm, and that doesn't depend on the DEB, all right? And you use that competitive LMP to essentially only mitigate a portion of the energy bid for that resource above that competitive LMP. And now when you do that, you take the lower of the submitted bid or the default energy bid for that resource, which does not depend on this methodology. This methodology only does the assessment of whether you need to mitigate a bid or not. It doesn't tell you how to do it. The how to do it is when you use the DEB. So the DEB is not relevant for this methodology.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. I don't see any further questions. I did submit on the chat for those who would like to provide any informal feedback or questions for today's working group session. Feel free to submit those on that link provided on the chat window. Thank you. No more questions for you, George, at this time.
Thank you, Brenda. Okay, I believe we have one more example here that is going down the path of getting a little bit more complex scenarios. And in this one, let's walk through this. So again, 1 fails. So we need to mitigate BA1. 3 and 4 fail. We need to mitigate 3 and 4. All right. Then when we add 2 to 1 and we test 1 and 2 together, let's say that this passes. So again, like in the previous scenario, the competitive LMP of $20, which is BA2, is used to mitigate the bids in BA1. Okay, so far so good, nothing changes. So we'll bring now 5 into and merges the groups all together from 1 through 5. Let's say this fails. So now we need to mitigate BA5. And now in the previous scenario, we brought 7 and 9 and the whole thing became competitive. So we picked up the LMP of $20 as the competitive LMP to mitigation for 3, 4, and 5. Let's say in this scenario, when we bring 7 and 9, the entire group also fails. So we still don't have a competitive LMP. Now we need to mitigate 7 and 9 as well. All right, then we bring in 6 and 8. Now we have the entire set of BAAs in one group, all of them. And let's say that this still fails, okay? So now we also need to mitigate 6 and 8. And we don't have a competitive LMP because we never found any competitive group in this process. The only competitive group that we have is back then 3 and 4. We know they're competitive on their own and they stay competitive through this process. We're not going to go and mitigate them, but we're going to use $25 because that's for their group, not for the entire group. In the rest of the group of BAAs, we found $20 to mitigate one, but for the mitigation of, actually, I also have 3, 4 failing here. So for the mitigation of every other BAA, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I don't have a competitive LMP. We never found competitive conditions that include all these BAAs. So in this case, we're going to proceed to mitigate all these BAAs, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, using non-competitive LMP. So basically, we mitigate the entire energy bid. There is no threshold that is not mitigated. Okay, so that's the outcome. This is what I wanted to show you. It's a little bit of an edge case scenario. We'll probably never get there. So let me see if there are any questions on this edge case scenario that the entire market footprint is not
Go ahead,
competitive.
Callie.
Yeah, hey, Jared, just real quick. So it's not that, so you're saying you wouldn't mitigate them at all, or you would just mitigate them down to their depth?
They will be mitigated to the lower of the bid or the DEB, the lower of the submitted bid or the DEB, without having any threshold. So you start from the beginning of the energy bid all the way to the end. There is no threshold that says that part is competitive because of your competitive LP. Your competitive LP is minus infinity. Basically, the entire bid is mitigated, is subject to mitigation.
Okay. I assume that was the case, that we were still looking at the DEB, but I just wanted to clarify there. Thanks.
Any more questions?
No questions.
All right, we'll finish with one more that basically we want to have an example to show you how this method would work if, emphasis on if, the status quo of considering the California ISO balancing authority areas always competitive is maintained, which is subject to discussion in the next call that we're going to have. And we want to show you that this methodology does not depend really on the status quo, having it or not having it. You can have it either way. So it's a methodology that is robust enough to accommodate the status quo or not. So in our in this scenario, we'll assume that BAA 5 is the California ISO balancing authority area, and it's assumed always competitive. So we go through the steps. Let's say one fails, so we decide to mitigate BAA 1. Let's say 3 and 4 pass, okay, in step 2. So these are competitive, not mitigated. We bring 2 into 1, and the group of 1, 2 fails. So now we can mitigate, the group fails, so also BA2 needs to be mitigated in addition to 1, because the group fails. And then we bring 5. What happens when we bring 5? 5 is the ISO. 5 is considered an always competitive BAA, and anything that is grouped with it, the entire group is automatically considered competitive. So we don't perform a test for the group of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We say it includes the ISO, it passes. Okay, it's deemed competitive. And once we do that, immediately we have the competitive LMP of the ISO being $15, which will be used now to mitigate 1 and 2 that they were previously found to be uncompetitive. And then, of course, as we continue, you basically add more BAs to the ISO group. So again, you don't perform any tests. You assume that this group is deemed competitive, and you proceed with the algorithm, and the only mitigation that you have at the end of it is for BAS 1 and 2 that they were found to be uncompetitive before you join the ISO in that group. Questions?
No questions, George.
Thank you very much. I believe this was the, oh, no, that's for you, Brenda. I give you the mic.
Thank you, George. Appreciate it. Now, I believe we can go ahead if you could provide me the slide deck presentation, that'll be perfect. Thanks everyone for joining. We have covered a few items for today's call. As well, we wanted to kind of highlight the upcoming meetings that we have scheduled in our calendar. We plan to hopefully submit a notice for the upcoming meeting for November 14th. This meeting is for fast start pricing, so it's not with this current series that we have, but we will plan to submit a notice once that gets updated for next week. And as well, we do have the upcoming November 20th call as well. We do also have that link that takes everyone to a working group schedule. We'll make sure that's up to date with the meetings that we are, having for this price formation enhancements. As well, we submitted in the chat a Menti questionnaire. If you like to submit those, you have the option to submit them anonymously or provide your organization or your name, and that way we can also review those with our team. On the next page, I'm showing here is the initiative for the stakeholder page. We have added the phase 2. So you'll see on the website, phase 2 will start kicking off all those meeting series, all those documents and presentation. We also provided that slide deck that we presented this morning today, and it's also posted right now on that price formation enhancements initiative webpage. If you do have any questions, I do see Alva. Let's go ahead and take his question.
Hi, Brenda, I just had one last question for George, actually. It's really kind of a takeaway from all of these examples is that, in terms of one of the things you brought up for the grouping is to reduce unnecessary mitigation, and that seems clearly to be happening. But what it also appears to be the case that if there is market power, this approach will tend to result in more mitigation of the resources that were initially judged to have market power. At least they would be mitigated at lower levels, so more of their bids would be mitigated. Is that sort of kind of a correct takeaway from this approach?
You're referring to how we determine the competitive LMP, which for
Right.
some BAs could be lower because
it can only go lower, right? It can only go lower
as you proceed. So
Yeah.
you will be mitigating a
a
higher volume of the energy bid, if you will, because you start mitigating from a lower threshold. That's what you're saying, Alva?
Yeah. Just trying to get I think that's what this is showing. I just wanted to make sure I understood that.
Right. So, and you're correct, but that whether this is a bad or a good thing, it's up for discussion. In this methodology, we can claim that the calculation or the determination of the competitive LMP is more accurate than simply picking up a BAA like the ISO and saying we're going to use that marginal energy cost to be the competitive LMP. Let's find out which is the competitive LMP by finding out the first expanded group that becomes competitive, and we say, well, okay, now we have competitive conditions in that group, so let's pick up the MEC of that last BA that we added in this group because it made the group competitive, and that is the competitive LMP that we can use as a threshold for mitigating BAAs, uncompetitive BAAs in that group. And if you go further down, you find more uncompetitive BAAs, well, obviously this will have a lower competitive LMP because they're further down the tree. But whether this is bad or good, it's up for discussion. We think it's more accurate based on the merits of and the rationale of the grouping approach.
What you just said made sense. So basically, the alternative is not the higher, like I was just looking at BAA1 here. The alternative is not 30, it's either 20 or you go to 15, which would be the current choice if you were just mitigating based on the ISO. So in that sense, they actually are less mitigated under this approach than they would be if BAA5 were the CAISO and 15 was the reference level, then that would tend to mitigate more rather than less.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a great clarification. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Alva, for your questions. As well, thank you, George, for walking us through with great examples. I'm sure the stakeholders really appreciate it. Going back to our slides, just to recap, we have meetings coming up. We appreciate James leading us on many of these discussions. We have one coming up next week. And then lastly but not least, if you have any questions, feel free to send us either an email, feel free to send us through that Mentimeter questionnaire. We can also provide responses at the next upcoming BA level market power mitigation working group session. But thanks so much, everyone. Thanks. We'll go ahead and close this call, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.